Hi, welcome to the second module for course. In this lesson we will actually start writing the code for our application, and we're going to start with state management. That's a little bit counterintuitive rather than starting with the user interface, because I think state management is easier if you separate it from React. That is, React comes with a certain way of dealing with state, but it kind of mixes state with the way the UI is rendered, so that makes it hard to reason about. So I'd rather start with that. So we're going to use MobX. MobX is a library based on the observer pattern. So here I am on the MobX website, and you can see this small graph. So basically on MobX you have certain events that trigger actions. Those actions update an observable state. The change in your state notifies the computed values, which recalculate themselves, and those trigger side effects like rendering or rerunning a function and other stuff. So basically the main piece of the puzzle are observables. An observable is nothing more than an abstraction around a basic value. So once you have a value, you wrap it into an observable, and that enables it for it to be observed by other objects and other functions. So if you're a native Swift developer, maybe you have worked with the Combine framework, so it's the same idea. So MobX is traditionally used with classes. Here on the website you can see the first example that they give you is with a class, but we're going to use factory functions. That's going to make our life a little bit easier. So let's just set up our first piece of code, and then we will go over the properties a little bit more into detail. So I'm just going to start setting up a root store. A root store, it's going to be the entry point for all of our state. So I'm just going to go into our application, and on the source folder I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be called store.tsx. I'm just going to take the code in the lesson, and I'm just going to paste it into this file. So let's just walk over it. First I import a create UI store function, which is not there. We're going to create it in a little bit, but it again follows the same pattern. This is a factory function for a specific store. Then I'm going to declare iRoot store type, or an interface, which is going to help the TypeScript compiler figure out all the types. The problem is that we cannot derive all the types from our small stores because they depend on the root store, and we cannot derive the type of the root store without creating the smaller stores. So it's kind of a recursive problem. So we're just gonna give the compiler a hand and just tell it, you know, this is our UI store, its return type is whatever this function declares. So we're just giving the compiler a hand here. Then we have our main function. This is where we're gonna create the instance itself of our root store. So here you can see it. We have the store. It's just an empty object for now. And we declare it as any because once we return it, the TypeScript compiler is gonna figure out on its own. So then we create a new property, and we actually call our UI store, and we pass our root store instance, right? So this is so that the smaller stores have access to all the global state or to the other stores, so they can call another function, they can talk to each other. And finally we return the instance of the store. So we will also import a final instance. This is the one that we're gonna use on our main application. And we could have just created this on the module level without a function, but by putting this into a function, that makes it nicer for testing, right? If at some point we need to create an empty root store, we can just call this function and not worry about how the module has been loaded or any other stuff. So before moving on, let's just go back to the lesson a little bit and let's talk about computed properties and actions. So an observable is fairly straightforward. It's just a wrapper that around a simple object or a simple value which can be observed. But we haven't talked a lot about observers. So observers can be either computer properties or React components. Computer properties are just that, are properties that get computed, derived from observables. So in the JavaScript world and in MobX, they're just functions. So functions are observers of any observable used inside of them. This means whenever a function that uses an observable inside of it, whenever that observable changes, the function is gonna rerun itself. So here's a nice example in a completely different context of how this is supposed to work. And this was actually how MobX was created. So on Microsoft Excel, you have probably worked with it. You have cells with values, and on different cells, you can actually create some formulas which are dependent on other cells. So whenever I change any of the values that feed into this formula, this cell gets recalculated. So that was the base idea that inspired MobX. That's basically how it works. So the last part of the puzzle are actions. So the problem with observables in JavaScript is that things can get out of sync. You could be calculating some result based on the observables, and then the observable can change. So then your state is not consistent, right? The final value is not reflecting of the state. So that's what actions are. Actions just kind of prevent these race conditions and make sure that there's order to the operations, right? You update the observable, you calculate it. Until that calculation is finished, you cannot do anything else. Great. So that's the very high level overview of MobX. So let's now go into how to use the observables. MobX has a fairly simple API. The latest version has made it quite a lot simpler. So we're just going to use a single function. It's called makeAutoObservable. So makeAutoObservable takes an object and it's going to enhance all the properties in this object. So non-function properties, numbers, arrays, objects, etc., they're going to become observables. Getters, which are special JavaScript functions, they're going to become computed properties. And any other function is going to become an action. So now comes the time where we'll create our first MobX store, proper MobX store. So I'm just going to take this file, and back in our project, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call it stores. Here, I'm going to create a UI store.ts file, and I'm just going to paste it. Let me just quickly fix this import. Great. So we're still kind of missing a little bit of things. Namely, we need MobX and React bindings. So I'm just going to go to the terminal. I'm just going to do it inside of VS Code. And I'm going to do yarn add MobX and MobX React Lite. So MobX is the library and MobX React Lite is the bindings for the React component. Great, so let's just go over the store a little bit. So first we're going to import the makeAutoObservable function from MobX. Then we're going to import our type from our root store. And we can finally create the main function for our store. So it's going to take an instance of the root store, which is going to make it so that this store will be able to access any future stores. Inside of it, we will create the instance of the store itself by calling makeAutoObservable, and we pass an object to it. So this object has a books array inside of it, It's fairly simple, it's just title and I created that string. So makeOutObservable is gonna take this property and make it an observable property. Then we have a getUpperCaseBooks function. This is gonna be a computed property because inside of it we're using the books array. So we're just gonna take the books array and we're gonna map over it. That means we're gonna take each book and apply a function to it. We're gonna keep all the properties of the book, but the title, we're gonna uppercase it, right? And we just need to give the compiler a little bit of a hand here. And we need to declare the type of the returning function, which is just the same book array. The title is just gonna be uppercased. And finally, we have the addBook function, which is gonna take a title, and we're just gonna push inside of our book array a new book, which is just an object with a title and a new creation date. So if we go back to our store, we can see that the import error is gone because we have now our UI store created. And we can finally start connecting our React state or React UI to our stores. In order to do this, I'm gonna add just a little bit more variables into our root store. I'm just taking them from the lesson, and let me just fill the missing import. So these are context. It's a mechanism of React itself to share values. So I'm creating a context which is going to hold our root store. A provider, we're going to see in a little bit how that's used, and a hook, a function that we're going to use inside of our components to take the root store from the context. So it's just a function, it doesn't take any parameters, and we just say use context and we pass the store context that we created before. So I'm gonna go back into our app.tsx file, and I'm gonna take one more time from the lesson the code. Just gonna paste it in here. So basically the thing that has changed is that we're now importing a books component from a container. We're gonna talk more about containers afterwards, but this is just a React component. We're gonna create it in a little bit. Afterwards, I import my root store instance and my store provider from the store file I just created. Inside of it, the first thing, or the first component that I'm gonna use is the store provider. As a value, I'm gonna pass the instance of my root store. This already has it. If you take a look into when we declared it, we already passed it, but the types are declared like this. So I'm just gonna pass it again. Don't worry too much about it. And inside of it, I'm gonna use my books component, my books container. It's fairly simple for now. So let's just go and create our books container. So I'm gonna create a new folder in here. I'm gonna call it containers. Then I'm gonna create my books.container.tsx file. Once again, I'm just gonna take the code from the lesson. Right, so let's just go over it. First, I import React so I can use JSX. Then I'm gonna import the observer function. So this enhances React components to act like any other observer function. Whenever one of the observables inside of the component changes, the component is gonna re-render itself. Next, I import some React Native components. And finally, I import my useStore hook function from the store file. So my books component is just a functional component, and I enhance it by calling observer on it. Inside of it, I have my root store, which I get by calling the useStore function. And finally, I can return some UI components. So inside of it, you can see I access the root. store. Inside of it, I access the UI store, and finally I access the uppercase books. And finally I map through them so I can display them in my UI. I take each book, put it inside a view. I need a key. This is just some React Native key that it needs to render our UI. Finally, a text component where I just show the book title. I have also added a button with a simple add button title, just so we can make sure everything is working. Inside of it is just a hard-coded function where I just call the add book action with a hard-coded value. So let me just save these two files. And now if we start our app, everything should be working. I'm just gonna do it inside of VS Code. You can do it inside of your terminal, whatever you want. And there you go. Our books from our UI store are displayed on our UI. And if I click on the add button, it should add more values.